Here's a step-by-step process on how to set difficulty class in your D&D 5e game. This is, of course, just a theory because you're here on my page, but regardless, it's good and mathematical and hopefully it will help you. So step one is to figure out what it would be like for someone who has never had any experience with a thing to do that thing. The scale we are going to use to qualify that would be the scale that we have in the player's handbook, which is asking ourselves the question, if you've never done this thing before, would it be very easy to pick up, kind of medium to pick up, hard to pick up, very hard to pick up, or nearly impossible to pick up? Each of those qualifiers are on a table in the player's handbook with a number next to them, and that number is the difficulty class for a task that would be qualified as something with one of those qualifiers. A pro tip to remember too when you're setting this is to remember that something that is very easy is something that you could still potentially fail 2 times out of 10. If you're having trouble with that concept, go check out my last video. Once you've assigned a difficulty that way, that is being very easy, etc., then you can move on to step 2. Step 2 is to ask yourself, how much experience does the PC have with this particular thing in a number of years format? Now, this is where things start to get a little money, so I'm going to use this whiteboard. I'm sorry, I know it's like school, but it kind of helps to have a visual. A good example to think about is riding a bike here. So we could say that riding a bike is something easy. Even though it takes a little bit of practice, it's something you can pick up kind of quickly, easy for a kid to do, etc. So let's set our DC for this at 10. So now that we have this number, we can go and try and calculate how many years experience to take off from this number. So generally, if you've ridden a bike since you were a kid, you might think, well, I'm 20 now, maybe I have 15 years of experience riding a bike. But in reality, the only time in your life where you used a bike as a form of transportation was maybe when you were 8 to 12. So instead of having 10 years of experience, you've only ridden a bike regularly as a skill for 4 years. So important thing to remember here is the amount of time that they've spent using the skill proficiently would be the amount of time that they've used it regularly, not just the amount of time it's been since they began learning the skill. With 4 years of experience riding a bike regularly and a DC of 10 for it being an easy task, we can now subtract that 4 from this 10 to make a DC of 6. Step 3 would be to further subtract from these DC based on the level of skill that they were practicing that skill at when they were practicing it regularly. In this case, we can liken it to player levels. Now, depending on your world, you could say that many people reached level 20 at something, and that's a common thing, and therefore this DC could be higher because of that. In my games, generally, I top things out about 14 for the limits of anyone that's not a legendary hero. So on my scale, 1 to 3 would be about beginner, 4 to 7 would be intermediate, 8 to about 10 or 11 would be pro, someone who could do that thing as a job, and 11 or 12 to 14 would be an expert, someone who has either gone to school for the thing and done it as a job, or does it so well that they've received accolades, rewards, etc. for it. So for this example for bike riding, we might say that 4 years of experience is relatively equal to an intermediate level of 4. So we'd subtract 4 from this DC. So now, someone who's proficient with this skill, someone who's practicing it regularly, could not fail this check. But if they don't actively have a proficiency bonus for it on their character sheet, they could still fail if they don't have the natural inclination. To me, 2 or 3 or 4 makes it live right in the if they roll a 1, it's funny range. Alright, now that we've got the concept, let's do one ourselves. Let's use the fantasy example of forging a dagger, just like Skyrim. Now, if someone who has no experience with blacksmithing were to approach a forge and try to forge a dagger, it would undoubtedly crack and the steel wouldn't fold correctly. But there is a chance that if they spent long enough, they could figure out the technique on their own. And to generally qualify as a dagger, it doesn't necessarily have to be a pristine blade. It could be cracked, charred, disfigured in horrible places. Anyways, we're going to say that that is a hard thing to do. Alright, now that we've set our DC, now we can think about how many years to subtract from this. Let's say, for example, that the player character who's trying to smith a dagger is a dwarf who grew up forging. Someone who has maybe 5 or 8 years of experience, we'll say 6 for this example. Keep in mind that they probably will have blacksmith tools proficiency already on their character sheet, and maybe an ability score that feeds into that skill as well. So we're going to subtract 6 from this 20 and get 14. Now in my world, Dwarven smithing takes a lifetime to master, so someone with 6 years experience might really only be intermediate. So saying intermediate is at minimum a level 5, we can change this DC to a 9. To me, for someone with prior experience and a culture centered around this sort of activity, a 9 makes sense for forging their first blade, or even their second or third blade. It's just hard enough that they could fail, but just easy enough that it represents how much the skill and practice they've put in pays off.